In Kharkiv, there is an old psychiatric hospital. In one of its oldest buildings, there used to be a room known as Ward 13. They say it was sealed behind a wall after one of the patients disappeared without a trace. But sometimes, late at night, the staff still hear sounds coming from behind that wall, footsteps, whispers, as if someone is still there. One day, the wall was finally opened, and the doctors discovered a terrifying truth. Ward 13 is not just a room, it's a door, and one night, someone knocked from the other side. Ward 13, the secret of the Kharkiv Asylum. In Kharkiv, there is an old psychiatric hospital that people rarely speak about out loud. It has stood on the outskirts of the city for more than 100 years. Long yellow buildings, dark windows and old trees bending over the walls create a strange feeling, as if the place itself remembers far too much. Doctors still work at the hospital today, but one of the buildings has been closed for many years. Its doors are locked with a heavy iron chain, and the corridors inside remain empty and silent. That is where Ward 13 once was. Many years ago, a patient was kept in that room, a man the doctors considered dangerous. He rarely spoke to anyone, but sometimes he quietly repeated the same words over and over again. They come at night. They stand behind the door. The doctors believed it was just another delusion, but one young doctor began to notice something strange. Every night at exactly 3 o'clock, the patient would sit up in his bed and stare at the door of the ward, as if he were waiting for it to open. One night, that same doctor was on duty. It was close to 3 in the morning. The corridors of the hospital were silent, the ceiling lamps glowing dimly in the darkness. And then he heard footsteps, slow, clear, as if someone was walking down the long corridor. At first, the doctor thought it was one of the orderlies, but when he stepped into the hallway, there was no one there. Yet the footsteps continued, and they were moving closer, closer to Ward 13. The doctor slowly approached the door. It was closed, just as always. But from inside the room, he could hear a quiet whisper. Carefully, he opened the door. The patient was sitting on his bed, staring directly at the doorway. His eyes were wide open. "Do you hear them too?" the patient asked softly. The doctor tried to answer, but at that moment, the footsteps echoed again in the corridor. This time, right outside the door, the lamp above the entrance flickered, and suddenly, everything went silent. The doctor stepped back. When he looked into the ward again, the bed was empty. The patient had vanished. The doors and windows were locked. No one saw him leave the building. He was never found. After that night, Ward 13 was sealed. A few years later, the entire building was closed, but the night guards still tell a strange story. On quiet nights, when the wind barely moves the trees, something can be heard inside the old building. Footsteps, slow, careful, as if someone is walking through the empty corridor and stopping right outside the door of Ward 13. They say if you stand there long enough at night, you can hear a faint voice, almost a whisper. "They've come again. They've come." After those words, silence returned to the corridor. The guards say that sometimes the story ends there. The footsteps fade away and the building becomes quiet again, as if nothing had happened. But there are nights when the story continues. One of the night guards who worked there a few years ago decided to check the old building. He didn't like the fact that every night the motion sensors on one floor kept activating for no reason. It was almost 3 in the morning. He turned on his flashlight and slowly opened the door to the abandoned corridor. Inside, the air smelled of dust and old plaster. The lights had stopped working long ago, so the only illumination was the narrow beam of his flashlight. The corridor was long. The doors to the wards were closed on both sides. After he took a few steps, he heard a faint sound somewhere ahead, as if someone else had taken a step too. The guard froze. The beam of his flashlight trembled in his hands as he pointed it toward the end of the corridor, but there was no one there. And then he heard a whisper, very quiet. "They're here." The guard turned around sharply, but there was no one behind him either. The whisper seemed to come from somewhere ahead. He slowly walked forward, and then he saw the door. Old! Scratched! The paint was peeling from the surface, On it he could barely make out a number. 13. The guard knew the story. In the hospital, people spoke about it almost in whispers, but he had never believed in things like that. He stepped closer. The door was locked. An old rusted padlock hung from the handle, but something was wrong. A faint light was slowly seeping out from beneath the door, dim, yellow, as if an old lamp was burning inside. A cold shiver ran down the guard's spine. That building had not had electricity for many years. He leaned closer to the door, and then he heard the voice, the same one, a weak, hoarse whisper. "Don't open it. They're standing behind the door." The guard stumbled back. At that very moment, the door handle slowly twitched, as if someone on the other side was trying to turn it. The light beneath the door flickered, and footsteps echoed through the corridor. This time, there were many of them, as if several people were slowly walking down the hallway, straight toward him. The guard ran. He rushed out of the building without even looking back. After that night, he quit his job, and the old building was sealed even tighter than before. But sometimes the hospital staff noticed something strange. If you walked past the locked doors of the old wing around 3 a.m, you might hear a sound. A quiet creak, as if someone is slowly opening the door to a ward, Ward 13. After that incident, people began to speak about the old building again, but only in whispers. The hospital administration decided not to mention it anymore. The doors were locked, the keys were hidden, and the staff were advised not to enter the building unless absolutely necessary. Years passed. New doctors came to work at the hospital and knew nothing about Ward 13. The older orderlies stayed silent, but sometimes during night shifts they exchanged uneasy glances when the clock slowly approached 3 a.m, because that was when strange things sometimes happened. One winter evening, a new medical intern arrived at the hospital. He was young and very curious. When he overheard fragments of old conversations about the sealed building, he decided to learn more. The staff told him only one thing: don't go there at night. Of course, that only made him more curious. That night, when most of the patients were already asleep, the intern quietly stepped into the corridor. The hospital was silent. Somewhere far away, an old heater hummed softly. He walked toward the door that led to the old building. The lock looked ancient, but the door was slightly open, as if someone had just gone inside. The intern turned on the flashlight on his phone and carefully stepped into the dark corridor. The air inside felt cold and heavy. Dust covered the floor in a thick layer, and his footsteps left clear marks behind him. But after a few meters, he suddenly stopped. There were already footprints on the floor in front of him, fresh ones, as if someone had walked through the corridor only minutes earlier. The footprints led deeper inside. The intern slowly followed them. The corridor seemed longer than it should have been. The beam of his flashlight slid across the old doors of the wards, and then he saw the number, 13. The door was open. His flashlight illuminated the dark room. Inside stood an old bed, a table, and walls covered with scratches, as if someone had been clawing at them for years. The intern stepped inside. At that moment, the door behind him quietly closed. He turned around sharply. The corridor was dark, but someone was standing there, a tall figure, still, silent. The flashlight in the intern's hand trembled. "Who are you?" he asked quietly. The figure did not answer. It only slowly tilted its head, and then the intern heard the familiar whisper, very quiet, almost impossible to hear. "They've come." The flashlight went out. The next morning the intern was nowhere to be found. His phone was lying on the floor of the old corridor. And the door toward 13 was closed, locked, with a padlock that no one had locked. Since then, the hospital staff sometimes notice something strange at night. If you stand in that corridor for too long, you can hear 2 different voices behind the door. One quietly repeats, "They're behind the door," and the other whispers, "Don't come in." After the intern disappeared, the hospital was investigated. The police arrived and searched the entire building, every room, every corridor. But they found nothing unusual. The old wing was empty. They opened the door toward 13. Inside, dust covered everything, just like in the rest of the abandoned building. The old bed stood against the wall, and the window was locked from the inside. There were no signs of a struggle, no signs that anyone had been there. It was as if no one had ever entered the room at all. Eventually, the police concluded that the intern must have left the hospital grounds on his own. The case was closed, but the hospital staff knew one detail that no one told the investigators. On the night the intern disappeared, several patients woke up at the exact same time. They began banging on the doors of their rooms, repeating the same words over and over again. They're walking in the corridor. They're searching. The orderlies barely managed to calm them down, and the old guard, the same one who had once heard the footsteps, sat silently in the security room that night, staring at the camera monitors. On one of the screens, the door to the old building could be seen. At one point, the camera detected movement. The door slowly opened. A figure stepped out from the darkness of the corridor. At first, the guard thought it was the missing intern, but when he looked closer, a cold chill ran down his spine. It was not the intern. The figure moved strangely, slowly, almost gliding across the floor, and the most terrifying part was something else. Behind that figure, deeper in the darkness of the corridor, there were others, several dark silhouettes. They did not move, they only watched, as if they were waiting. The figure stopped near the exit of the building. Then it slowly turned its head toward the camera. Its face was pale, too pale, and its eyes were empty. The guard recognized it immediately. It was the patient who had disappeared many years ago from Ward 13. Suddenly, the camera feed began to flicker. The image disappeared for a few seconds, and when it returned, the corridor was empty again. The door to the building was closed, as if it had never opened at all. That same morning, the guard wrote his resignation. Before leaving, he said only one thing to the head doctor. Ward 13 must be sealed. A few weeks later, workers were sent to the old building. Their job was to brick up the entrance to the ward so that no one could ever enter it again. When they removed the old door to the room, one of the workers suddenly called the others. There were scratches on the inside wall, dozens of them, hundreds, and among them were words carved into the surface with crooked, desperate letters. The same sentence repeated again and again. They are not behind the door, they are inside. The workers sealed the opening with bricks that very same day. Now the corridor looks like an ordinary wall. Most of the newer staff members do not even know that a room once existed there. But sometimes during stormy nights when the lights in the hospital flicker or go out, something can be heard in that quiet corridor. A sound, soft, barely audible, as if someone on the other side is slowly knocking on the wall and patiently waiting. Many years passed. The older hospital staff slowly left their jobs. Some retired, some moved away, and some simply stopped talking about the story altogether. The new doctors knew almost nothing about Ward 13. The corridor where it once stood looked completely ordinary now. The wall was smooth, freshly painted. No one would ever guess that a room had once existed behind it. But sometimes the doctors noticed something strange. At night, around 3 a.m, the lights in that corridor would begin to flicker. At first, they blamed the old wiring. Later, electricians checked the entire system. They found nothing wrong, but the lights continued to flicker, always near that same wall. One night, a nurse was carrying medicine to the patients when she paused near that spot. She thought she heard a sound, very quiet, as if someone had gently run a hand across the wall. She assumed one of the patients had stepped into the corridor, but when she turned around, the hallway was empty. Then the sound came again, this time more clearly, a faint knocking from inside the wall. The nurse leaned closer, and at that moment she heard a whisper, very weak, as if the voice were pushing through a thick layer of stone. "Open the door." She stepped back in shock. Her heart began to race. The nurse took a few steps away and was about to leave when she suddenly heard another sound. Footsteps, from the other side of the wall, slow, and there were many of them, as if several people were walking around inside a small room. Then everything suddenly fell silent. The next day, the nurse told the head doctor what she had heard. He listened without speaking. Then he opened an old cabinet in his office and pulled out a yellowed folder. Inside were old hospital records. Among them was the patient file from Ward 13. The doctor slowly turned the pages. At the very end was a note written many years ago, just one short sentence. "The patient keeps insisting that there are others in the room." The head doctor stared at that line for a long time. Then he quietly said, "We sealed the wrong side." That same evening he ordered workers to inspect the old corridor again. When they began removing the plaster from the wall, one of them suddenly froze. He called the others over. Behind the bricks there was an empty space, but it looked wrong. The walls inside were scratched, as if someone had wandered there in the darkness for a very long time, and on the floor there were footprints, fresh ones, as if someone had been walking there only moments ago. The workers stood silently, staring into the dark opening, and then they heard a sound from inside, a slow step, then another, and a familiar whisper drifting out of the darkness. "You finally opened it." The workers stepped back sharply from the opening. A heavy silence fell over the corridor. No one dared to move closer. The darkness behind the broken brick wall seemed far too deep. The beam of a flashlight barely reached the opposite side. One of the workers cautiously shined his light inside. The room was small, much smaller than a hospital ward should have been. The walls were covered in scratches. A thick layer of dust lay across the floor, yet clear footprints cut through it. Fresh ones, as if someone had been walking there only minutes ago. The head doctor stood behind the workers, silently staring into the dark opening. "Is someone in there?" one of the workers asked quietly. No one answered, but from the darkness came another sound, a step, then another, slow, dragging, as if someone were walking barefoot across the cold floor. The workers instinctively backed away, and then a hand appeared from the darkness, pale, thin. It slowly reached out and touched the edge of the broken wall. The flashlight in one worker's hand trembled, and a figure stepped out of the darkness. It was a man, tall, thin, wearing an old hospital gown. His hair was long and tangled, and his skin looked almost grey. He stood in the beam of the flashlight, staring at the people in front of him. His eyes were wide open. "You opened it," he whispered. No one moved. The head doctor slowly stepped forward. "Who are you?" he asked quietly. The man slowly tilted his head, and suddenly he smiled, a strange, unnatural smile. "I told you," he whispered. "They stand behind the door." At that moment, footsteps echoed again in the darkness behind him. Many footsteps, slow ones, as if several people were moving inside the small dark room. The workers quickly pointed their flashlights deeper inside, and for a moment, it seemed as though other shapes were standing there in the darkness, still, silent, watching. They did not step forward, they simply waited. The man in the hospital gown slowly turned his back to them, as if listening. Then he looked back at the people in the corridor and quietly whispered, "Now they know the door is open." At that exact moment, all the flashlights went out. The corridor fell into complete darkness, and the last thing anyone heard that night was the sound of footsteps, slow footsteps, walking out of the dark room and into the long corridor of the old Kharkiv psychiatric hospital. The darkness in the corridor was so thick it felt as if you could reach out and touch it. No one moved. Somewhere deep inside the old building, slow footsteps echoed through the silence. First one, then another, then more. As if several people were beginning to walk out of that small hidden room behind the wall. The workers stood frozen. One of them tried to turn his flashlight on again. The light flashed for a single second, and in that moment everyone saw what was standing in the corridor. The man in the old hospital gown was no longer alone. Behind him stood other figures, 3, maybe 4 of them. They remained deeper in the darkness, their faces impossible to see. Only dark silhouettes, still, waiting. The man took a step forward. His bare feet slid softly across the cold floor. "We waited. A long time," he whispered. "We were here. For a very long time." The head doctor felt a cold pressure tightening in his chest. "How did you end up there?" he managed to ask. The man looked at him for a few silent seconds. Then he answered quietly. "The door was closed, and they stayed with me." Something slowly moved in the darkness behind him. One of the figures stepped closer, then another. The workers backed away toward the opposite wall. The flashlight flickered again in one of their trembling hands. For a brief moment, the light illuminated the faces of those standing behind the man. They did not look human. Their faces were pale and strangely stretched. Their eyes were dark, too dark, as if there was nothing inside them at all. The light went out again. In the darkness, breathing could be heard. Many breaths. The man in the hospital gown took another step forward. Now he stood very close to the people in the corridor. "You opened the door," he whispered. "Now they can come out too." Suddenly the doors of the hospital wards began to open along the corridor, one after another. Old hinges creaked in the darkness, as if the entire building were waking from a long sleep. From deep inside the hospital came another sound. Footsteps, more footsteps, as if someone was walking through the long corridors of the old hospital, and there were more of them with every second. In that moment, the head doctor realized something terrible. Ward 13 was never just a room, it was a door, and that door had just been opened. When the head doctor realized the truth, it was already too late. The sound of footsteps was slowly spreading through the corridor of the old building. They were no longer only near the sealed ward. They were moving farther, deeper into the hospital. The flashlights flickered on again for a few seconds. It was enough to see the dark figures beginning to move down the corridor. They were not in a hurry. As if, for the first time in a very long time, they were finally free to walk wherever they wished. One of the workers suddenly ran toward the exit. "We need to lock the building," he shouted. The others quickly began backing away toward the door, but the man in the hospital gown spoke again. His voice was quiet but strangely calm. "It's too late now." He slowly raised his head and looked into the darkness of the corridor. "They've been waiting for a very long time." At that moment, screams echoed from the other side of the building. A member of the hospital staff ran into the corridor. "The doors are opening," he shouted, "by themselves." All across the building, old locks began to creak. Ward doors slowly opened one after another. Patients woke up and stepped out into the corridors, confused and frightened. And in the darkness between them, other figures were already moving, silent, still, almost impossible to see. Only now and then the flickering lamps revealed pale faces for a brief second. The head doctor stepped back against the wall. His hands were trembling. "We have to lock the building," he whispered. But the man in the hospital gown slowly shook his head. The door was closed for too long. He stepped into the corridor, then another step, and the dark figures behind him began to emerge from the hidden room, one after another, like an endless shadow. A few minutes later, the old building fell silent again. The corridors were empty. The flashlights went out. The doors slowly closed. When the lights in the hospital finally came back on and the staff gathered together, they noticed something strange. The sealed wall was whole again, as if no one had ever broken it, as if Ward 13 had never existed at all. But on the fresh plaster, there was writing, crooked, uneven letters, as if someone had written them with their fingers directly on the damp wall. There were only 3 words: "We're already here." And since that night, something strange happens in the Kharkiv psychiatric hospital. Sometimes patients wake up at exactly 3 in the morning. They sit up in their beds and silently stare at the doors of their rooms as if they are waiting for someone to quietly knock from the other side. After that night, the hospital tried to return to normal life. The corridors once again filled with familiar sounds, the footsteps of doctors, the quiet conversations of nurses, the metallic clatter of medicine carts. But something in the building had changed. At first, the patients noticed it. Several of them began waking up at night with the same strange feeling, as if someone was standing inside their rooms. They would open their eyes, look toward the door, and they were certain they had just heard footsteps in the corridor. The doctors assumed it was simply night terrors. But a few days later, a nurse working the night shift noticed something strange. As she walked down the long corridor of patient rooms, she thought she saw someone standing ahead of her, a dark figure, completely still. She stopped. The figure did not move. "Who's there?" the nurse asked quietly. There was no answer. She took a few cautious steps forward and suddenly realized the corridor was empty. There was no one there, but something else felt wrong. Several of the ward doors were slightly open. She was certain she had closed them earlier, and from each narrow, dark gap, someone was watching. The patients. They were sitting on their beds, silently staring into the corridor. All of them, without exception, as if they were waiting for something. The nurse quickly closed the doors and continued down the hallway. But when she reached the end of the corridor, she heard footsteps behind her. She turned around sharply. The corridor was empty. The ward doors were closed, and then one of them slowly creaked, opening just a few centimeters. The nurse froze. From the narrow, dark opening came a quiet voice, very weak. "They are already here." That same night, the head doctor reviewed the security camera footage. Everything on the screens looked normal, empty corridors, closed doors, but at exactly 3 in the morning, one of the cameras suddenly began to flicker. The image became distorted, and for a few seconds a silhouette appeared in the corridor. Tall, completely still. It stood directly in front of the camera. Then it slowly tilted its head, as if it were looking straight at the person watching the monitor. After that, the camera shut off. When the image returned, the corridor was empty again. But the next morning, the orderlies noticed something new. There were scratches on several of the ward doors, long, deep, as if someone had been clawing at the wood from the inside, and beneath one of the doors lay a small piece of paper, old, yellowed. On it was written only a single sentence. "The doors no longer hold them back." After the note was discovered in the corridor, truly unsettling nights began at the hospital. The patients started waking up more and more often. Some of them began saying strange things. They claimed that at night people walked through the corridors, people they had never seen before. "They're not patients," one man whispered. "They come from the darkness." The doctors tried to explain it as stress and fear, but even the staff began to notice things that were becoming harder to ignore. Sometimes doors appeared in the hospital that no one remembered being there. One morning, an orderly found an old wooden door at the end of a corridor. It stood exactly where there had once been nothing but a wall. When he asked his co-workers about it, no one could explain where it had come from. The door had no number, only scratches, and a single word carved into the wood. 13. That same night, the head doctor decided to investigate it himself. He took a flashlight and slowly walked down the corridor. The hospital was asleep. Only the dim ceiling lamps cast pale light across the floor. He stopped in front of the door. His hand trembled slightly as he touched the cold handle. Behind the door, there was silence. Too much silence. The doctor slowly opened it. The flashlight illuminated the room. It was a small ward, old and strangely familiar. The same bed, the same scratched walls. Ward 13. It was here again, as if it had never been sealed away. The doctor stepped inside, and at that moment he heard footsteps behind him. Slow, quiet. He turned around. A figure was standing in the doorway, the same one. The man in the old hospital gown. His pale face was completely still. "You opened the door again," he whispered. The doctor felt a cold chill pass through his entire body. "What is this place?" he asked quietly. The man looked into the darkness of the ward. Then he answered, "This isn't a ward." He slowly raised his hand and pointed toward the dark corner of the room. "It's a passage." The flashlight in the doctor's hand trembled. The beam slid across the wall, and for a moment, he thought he saw movement there, as if shadows were slowly separating themselves from the darkness. The man smiled faintly. "They've been waiting a long time." Footsteps began to echo behind the doctor. First one, then another, then many more, all of them approaching the room, and slowly the doctor realized the most terrifying truth. This time, they had not opened the door. This time, someone had opened it from the other side.